Okay, welcome everybody to today's lecture. Can everybody hear me? Is this good? Microphone, everything working well? Everybody hear me? Okay. My name is Professor Rico Francis. I'm from the Department of Fine Arts and Art History, and I'll be talking to you today about Freud and psychoanalysis. So to begin, ever used the word subconscious, specific word subconscious? Welcome to Freud's world. Ever lost your keys and cannot find them, and then a few hours later they show up in exactly the place that you were looking for them, and you just cannot work out how you could have missed them there the first time around? Welcome to psychoanalysis. Let me start with a little anecdote. I can't raise my voice. It's a question of, is this better? Everybody here? Yes? Okay. Okay. So let me start with a little anecdote. I had a friend when I was at university who was really sharp and smart. Always did very well, and we often studied for exams together. Then one day, for an exam, she didn't show up. After the exam was over, I spoke to her and asked her what happened. She was in a terrible state. She just did not understand how it could have happened, but she had set the alarm clock. She had set the alarm clock, and she realized afterwards, after it was too late, that she had set it for the wrong time, PM instead of AM. This was completely atypical of her. She was always usually extremely responsible, fastidious, and careful. How could this have happened? Welcome to psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud is born in the Czech Republic in 1856. He dies in London in 1938 at the age of 82. However, at a young age, he moves to Vienna and lives and works there all his life, so Vienna in Austria, until he leaves Vienna for London, fleeing the Nazis in 1938, just a few months before he dies. So he's really a product of Vienna, which is at that time very much a cultural hub. He's trained as a medical doctor, specializing in neurology, but he very soon becomes interested in patients with psychological disturbances, and he spends the rest of his life working in that area. He develops the technique called psychoanalysis that we will be discussing today. So the word psychoanalysis, psycho, it comes from the Greek word psyche, which means the mind in general. It's the same word as you find in psychology. And analysis, which is the understanding of, or the breaking down into component parts so as better to understand what's happening. So psychoanalysis is the attempt at understanding the human mind by breaking it down into its component parts. Have a look at this picture over here. So when you first look at this picture, oops, hang on a sec. When you first look at this picture, oh no, that's not working. Aha, when you first look at this picture, it looks like nothing could be more solid, right? There's a massive big rock, there's a castle on top of the rock, and the castle is clearly made out of the same stone as the rock itself. It looks like the absolute perfect, most well-established foundation you could possibly hope to have. And yet this is just a segment of the picture. In fact, when you look at the whole picture, it's this. And this is a painting by René Magritte from the late 1950s. And the idea is exactly that. You start off thinking that everything is perfectly solid, and it ends up with the notion of castles in the air. And in some ways, you could use this to kind of sum up psychoanalysis in so many ways. So let me sum up what I think is Freud's most important contribution to contemporary thought. You think you're in control, as in the first slide, but you're not, as in this slide. But it's not that you're not in control because somebody else is in control. That sometimes happens too, but that's not what I'm talking about. You think you're in control of yourself, but you're not, because another part of you, one that you are not aware of, is instead in control of who you are. There's a hidden part of you that is responsible for pretty much all that you do and all that you think. And this is what Freud calls the unconscious. So the unconscious is, just as a brief introduction, most of what you do and think is actually the unconscious kind of doing its thing. So Freud divides up the mind into two major parts. There's the conscious and the unconscious. By the way, Freud never uses the word subconscious. That's a later kind of innovation. So the consciousness is the you who you think you are. It's the you that is available to your awareness of yourself. You think about yourself, your character, your personality, your likes, your dislikes, your experiences, your ethics and morality. So that's all part of the you who you think you are, your conscious. Now, attached to the conscious is the pre-conscious. It's like the reservoir from which the conscious draws for the most part. The things that you've forgotten but that you can remember with a little effort and memory jogging belong to the pre-conscious. So things that you kind of know but that you've forgotten, they're kind of stored in the pre-conscious, but you can get to them if you want to. I think that's generally what people are talking about when they talk about the subconscious. It's that idea that it's just kind of below conscious and you can kind of think your way through to it. The unconscious, however, is radically different both to the conscious and the pre-conscious. It consists of the things you don't even know you think. And what is more, it's blocked to your own conscious thinking. You can't get to it just by thinking or by remembering. It's barred, it's hidden. Pre-conscious, as I say, you can get to, you can think your way to it, but the unconscious you can't get to. So how does the unconscious happen, so to speak? Where does it come from? Well, we aren't born with it. It comes into being as we develop as children. So in the first place, this is a story about growing up, and thus it starts with infancy. Now, I want you to stop for a moment and think about what happens to kids as they get older, and how we as adults deal with them. On the one hand, when kids are very young, they're uncoordinated and they know nothing, so to speak. And we're always we're always saying to them, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, to teach them and to protect them in some way. But think about this another way. One of the things we're doing as we say, do this, don't do that, is that we're teaching them about becoming social human beings. We're teaching them to follow more and more the rules of society, of what you can and cannot do. And if you think even more about it, most of the time you pass with the very young is spent saying to them, don't do that. Kids seem to want to do lots of things that we as adults think they shouldn't be doing. But if you follow this through a little bit more about this phenomenon of having to say no to kids all the time, we arrive at the strange proposition. In order to become a functioning human being, a social being, like the people we live amongst and see around us, we only get to be that by learning not to do. There are tons of things that we do as kids that are entirely unacceptable, and we have to learn not to do them. So it's not just a question of learning to do things. I think generally we think kids have to learn to do things, but it's more a question of learning not to do things. But now here's the problem. We have these desires that are just not permissible to society. What do? You try to forget them. But think how long it takes to get kids to change. How often you have to say no. Forgetting of desires, and this is one of Freud's key insights, forgetting of desires is very difficult. In fact, says Freud, we never really forget. We never stop in our desires. They never go away. They just persist. So what do you do as a subject? What do you do when faced with what you desire so strongly, which is also the thing that you're prohibited from indulging in? Well, says Freud, because these things are forbidden, but equally because they don't go away, because you can't get rid of them, you suppress them. They're pushed kind of underground, and you try your best not to be aware of them. In fact, you pretend to yourself, although let's be technical here, you're conscious because that's the you you're aware of. Your conscious pretends to itself that these things don't exist. The technical term for this is repression. We repress these forbidden, prohibited desires. This means that they effectively become split off from our conscious minds. And that thing that consciousness excludes from itself, rejects from itself, and tries to forget is the unconscious. It's unconscious precisely because it's forbidden from entering consciousness. I can't emphasize enough how these things are radically separated from each other. It's not just unconscious because it's not in your conscious, but it's actively prevented. It's forbidden from entering into your conscious. Thus, the unconscious, containing all those desires, splits off and becomes its own entity with its own rules and modes of functioning. And those desires stay in there, bubbling away. They continue to affect us. They infiltrate our lives, push us in all sorts of strange directions, make us do all sorts of things that our conscious would never dream of, like the examples given above. Think of it as a suitcase into which you put all the things that are forbidden to you, all the thoughts, wishes, desires that you carry around with you, except that you don't even know that you're carrying it. So now we have the mind divided into two main parts. It's the conscious and the unconscious. Okay, call it maybe 2.5 with the preconscious, which is really just a part of consciousness. And let me just come back to memories for a moment. Now, some memories you can recall, right? As we said, for the preconscious, you may have forgotten them, but they can kind of be jogged. But some deep, deep memories relating to forbidden wishes and desires will become repressed and dispatched to the unconscious. To consciousness, these repressed memories will appear to have been forgotten because they are not even preconscious anymore. But in reality, they will not be forgotten or erased, but simply partitioned off. It's like they're sent off to a dark room in a house of whose existence you are not even aware. Now, I'm going to talk for a moment about subjectivity in general. We mentioned this already in relation to consciousness. It concerns you as a subject. You think of yourself. You have an idea of who you are, of what makes you, you. You know who you are because you think of yourself, so you are the subject of your own consciousness. But now here's the strange part. As far as you're concerned, when you think about yourself, you are one person. But from now on, with the unconscious, the subject is not one, but two. There is one you there is one you who is the you of consciousness, and another you who is the you of the unconscious. Your conscious is thinking about you in one way, and your unconscious is thinking about you in another. I'll give you a small example. You're walking down the street and you see something lying on the sidewalk. The kid in your unconscious says, as all kids do, something in front of me on the floor. Yum, let me pick it up and put it in my mouth. Your consciousness, the adult in you, is saying, yuck, that's disgusting. So thus you are the subject of two desires. And if you don't know it or feel it consciously, because it's all unconscious, you are, on a very minor level in this example, a conflicted subject, torn between two desires, between two subject positions. Now you can see why these childish desires have to be repressed, right? No socialized, functioning adult in their right mind could possibly admit to themselves that they have a desire such as this. In fact, says psychoanalysis, your disgust is one of the mechanisms to help you keep your repressed desires at a distance, to disavow that desire. So coming back to our first examples, right? The two examples that I gave you of being late for an exam or lost your keys. You can see now, so how did that happen? You're late for your exam. You wanted to go to your exam, but then somehow you missed your exam. That's because, says psychoanalysis, there are two desires in operation in conflict with each other. So there's the one which says, I'm a good student, I've got to get to class, I've got to get to do the exam. There's another one which is sort of in your unconscious, which is saying, I'm terrified of the exam, I really don't want to do it, I didn't study enough, if I miss it, maybe I can avoid it. Or if you've lost your keys somewhere, think about it. It's possible that you didn't really want to go to wherever it was that you were planning on going when you were looking for your keys in the first place. So now, on the one hand, this is, I mean, everybody can identify with this, right? But on the other hand, what this means in terms of your psyche, it means there are two kind of power centers that are operating separately with two different sets of desires, often in conflict with each other. Let me give you... Let me just show you this this diagram over here. So this is a diagram of the kind of model of the mind that Freud first comes up with. And you can see over here, this is the conscious level over here. Thoughts, perceptions, memories, stored knowledge. And you can see the solid line over here. And that's the bar between consciousness and the unconscious. And you go down to the unconscious in this area over here. There are fears, violent motives, immoral urges, all kinds of things that you wouldn't really allow up into consciousness. This is one of the graphic models that Freud, the way in which Freud is thinking of the human life is subdivided. Now, let's think about some of the broad repercussions of this. I want to come to the main theme of your reading for today, which is civilization and its discontents. Now, it's funny if you think about that. The word civilization is the thing that we think of as being the greatest achievement of humanity. Civilization relates to our social being, to our construction of society and living together in community. Before Freud, in general, people just asked, how can we make society better? People thought we could just get better at doing it, that there was nothing really standing in the way of constructing a better society. And that even more than that, the better the society, the happier we will be as humans. But Freud says, no, that's not how it works. He says our human nature, because of our unconscious, is fundamentally opposed to civilization. Freud is the first person to look at society and say that it's something that doesn't really suit us as humans. Society, gives us all sorts of benefits, but it also hurts us. To become civilized, we pay a huge price. We sacrifice a very large part of who we are. And that sacrifice really is very painful. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And that's because we repress our desires. We cannot indulge them, and so we are discontent. For most social theorists who are not Freudians, the question is, how can we construct a society that allows us all to be happy? Freud says, no matter what you do with society, we will always be unhappy, because the simple fact of being in society already prevents us from reaching happiness by forcing us to repress our unconscious desires. And again, just think of the things that we want to do. Think, for example, of the violence of children. Now, that clearly is something that's absolutely not permissible to society in civilization. Civilization has to banish that kind of violence because that kind of violence constitutes disintegrative forces of society. They have to be banned, as I say. But being desires, they don't go away. They go into the unconscious where they are repressed and always unhappy because they cannot be fulfilled. You can see that according to Freud, the mind is not just a big machine churning out ideas. It's very carefully organized into a series of compartments. And there is one more we have to talk about. One more of these compartments we have to talk about. So we've spoken about the you of consciousness. And in some of Freud's writing, the you of consciousness is also related with the ego, the term ego. Ego is just the Greek word for I, right? So consciousness and ego are more or less similar. But then there's one more thing, and that's called the superego. And I'm sure you've heard of that, but let's talk about that technically. Think back to the kids. We're saying no, 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 no to them all the time. But at a certain point, as they grow up, you don't have to say no so much anymore. They have learned the lessons you have been trying to teach them. Now, in a funny way, it's not because they've learned the lessons you've been trying to teach them. They hardly ever learn the lessons you're trying to teach them. But it's rather because they have become self-policing. What I mean by that is they have learned to say no to themselves. It's not that their desires have gone away. It's that they have learned to stop their desires from functioning all by themselves. And that's because they have internalized the voice of authority saying no, which means you don't have to say it anymore because you are now inside their head saying no to them. They hear an authority voice saying no, but now it's coming from inside, which means they have sectioned off another part of their mind that is now fully occupied by what was once an external voice, but is now an internal voice. This is called the superego, right? Super as in above, super because it's above the ego. It's kind of something like a policeman looking down on you all the time and saying, no, you can't do that. Now, this is important. When you say no to yourself, it is you saying no, but it's also not you. It's a part of you, but it's also a part of you that has been colonized or taken over by an outside authority voice. I'm going to show you another more complex diagram over here. So here you get that same idea of this split between the conscious or later term ego. Don't worry about the terminology. But here's that same idea of things that are more in this conscious sphere and things that are unconscious over here. But now you have a third part, which is the super ego, which applies both to the conscious and to the unconscious. So it's the system over here that, in some ways, as we've been saying, is the part that's saying no. So that's the part that's controlling what's happening over here, controlling the desire. That's this model. Now, the superego, on the one hand, is a good thing. It's responsible for your good behavior in society and the fact that you are here today, more or less, behaving yourselves. But it can also cause all sorts of problems. The most prominent of which I would say is guilt. I feel so guilty. I lied to my parents. I told them I was going to study with a friend, but really I went clubbing and had a wild night out on the town. On the one hand, your parents will be upset, but worse than your parents being upset with you is the fact that you are upset with yourself. That corrosion of your soul, the way the thought comes back to you and eats you up inside, is your superego biting into your ego. It's your idea of your parents, rather more than your parents themselves, that's functioning. And as I think we all know, often the idea is worse than the reality. Guilt leads to severe psychological problems, to paralysis, to depression, to distress in all sorts of ways. So now we have the model of the mind as sectioned off, but in conflict always with itself. And that is, in some ways, that sort of sums up Freud in a nutshell to some degree. Now, I've so far given you examples drawn from everyday life of the repressed not going away and of the things that we all do. But what Freud is famous for is treating disturbed people, who he himself calls neurotics. And in relation to mentally disturbed people, Freud discovers that many illnesses are caused by the return of the repressed. I'll give you an example. Say you hate potatoes. Makes no sense. Everyone loves potatoes. And it gets worse and worse, and you become ill, and you gag, and throw up at the thought of them, and you're obsessed. Every time you go out for a meal, you think, what if there are potatoes in that meal? And eventually it becomes so bad that you're scared to leave the house. And it really ruins your life. So you go to a psychoanalyst and you talk about it. And slowly you discover a memory, one of those unconscious memories, right? There's another child at school, someone who was a bully, someone who persecuted you, who really made you suffer. And this guy was always eating chips. And every time he approached you, you could smell those chips and knew what was coming. But after a time had passed and you grew up, you lost your awareness of the whole nasty, horrible story. And you thought you had forgotten about the events, but in reality, you repressed them because they were too painful for you to bear. And because you hated to think of yourself as a coward and as a victim. And then, years later, you suddenly find that you cannot bear potatoes or chips, and the fear takes over your life, and you have no idea why. This is the return of the repressed. Ideas sit in that dark suitcase we mentioned earlier and haunt you. And you're aware of the haunting. You're aware of the effect, but you have no idea where it comes from because it comes from the part of you of which you are literally unconscious. So Freud develops a therapy about bringing things to consciousness. He believes that you can unlock these problems, and the theory is that if you bring these repressed thoughts out of that dark suitcase and think them through, you will hopefully get better. Once you realize them, think about them, face them instead of repressing them, you draw that ferocious energy out of them and they stop haunting you to the same degree. Make the unconscious conscious and its dark power fades away. But now let's talk a little bit more about the unconscious and how it works, because the unconscious is where it's all happening. So now the unconscious is not just, as I was saying, it's not just conscious but not. It has a very different mode of operation. Now, consciousness is characterized largely by reason. Consciousness is where reasoning happens, where reasoning and logic happen. And it's characteristic of one of our ways of thinking. So if I say to you, why are you late? There was a traffic jam. Why are you wearing a jacket? It was cold. In the unconscious, however, there's a completely different way of thinking that has nothing to do with logic. There's no reason, there's no logic. Why are you late? The answer could be because the trees are green. There's no time in the unconscious. There are no opposites in the unconscious. If A is bigger than B, then in the unconscious that can also mean that B is bigger than A. Now, Freud gives two different terms for these different ways of thinking. To the conscious way of thinking, which is logic and reason, he calls that secondary process, right? So secondary process is the process of logical, rational thinking through things. To that first way of thinking, which is characteristic of the unconscious, he calls that primary process. We're going to talk about primary process now. So let me show you another diagram. Okay, now have a look at this. Oops. Here we go. So let's start with the word chair. Okay. And then we can go from chair to table. That kind of makes sense, right? And then we can go from table to stable. We can go from stable to strong. We can go from stable to horse, right? That all kind of makes sense. You can go from a horse to a car, different modes of transport, and you can go from a car to, let's say, you use the car to go to the shops. You can go this way. You go from the chair to the table, and then tables have legs. But then a leg can be broken. But then the opposite of broken would be perfect. Now, can you see that all of these things are related to each other, but the way they're related to each other is completely different. There's no one way of being related. So this one over here, chair to table, the relationship is because chairs and tables you often find them together, right? But the relationship between table and stable is not one of normal reality. It's one of hearing, right? It's the same sound, kind of thing you might find in poetry, right? So table to stable. And now think about stable. That's a word that actually has two different meanings. One of the meanings relates to stable, it's strong. And the other one is a stable is a place where you put a horse. So from each one of these points, you can jump off in a whole lot of different directions. And then from a horse is a mode of transport. Mode of transport is a car, and you can use a car to go shopping, right? And then similarly over there, tables have legs. Legs can be broken. The opposite of broken could be perfect. So there's a whole series of different ways in which you can draw relations between objects or between words specifically. And that's characteristic of the primary process. Now, there's nothing logical about this, right? There's no logical sequence in this. It's just associations. But the associations operate in all of these different ways. Now that's primary process. But now here's the really strange part about this. In the unconscious, as opposed to in the conscious, each one of these terms is equivalent. So in the unconscious, each one of these terms can substitute for another one of those terms. And this gives you some strange results. You'll see what I mean over here. Say you have something in your unconscious that it really wants to express, that it's really obsessed by. Let's go back to that guy who tortured you at school, and you really hate him and you want to break his neck. Your unconscious can represent that breaking his neck. Let's say we've got broken by any one of these terms along that, we call that signifying chain. Anywhere along that has the equivalent status of broken over there. So maybe you keep on thinking of a chair. Now you really want to break his neck, but really you keep on thinking of a chair. Maybe you think of a perfect round circle. Any or all of these could represent that fundamental wish of breaking that person's neck. And in fact, this example, as I first gave it to you, is a little unrealistic. It's unlikely that you would hate potatoes because that's too direct. You might say have a terrible obsession with vinegar, or something further along the chain of associations like crinkly packets. Now, how does this come out? It comes out in behavior, as we saw with some of our examples above. In fact, many neurotic symptoms are the acting out of these wishes. In our example above of the guy who tortured you, say you're always breaking chairs, or you're horrified by horses, or something like that. By the way, see what I mean by repressed wishes being incompatible with society and civilization. Your innermost wish is to be violent for a reason you don't even remember. Civilization can't deal with that. But there are other ways in which these wishes come out. One of them is free association. In fact, what I did over here when I put this together was just free association. I just kind of let my mind wander and make these associations. And this is one of the techniques that Freud uses in therapy. You go into the therapist, you lie down on the couch, and he says, just free associate. Just talk about the first thing that comes into your mind. And slowly you can trace your way back. For example, you might start there, and slowly you trace your way back to some of the points that are the key points that are bothering you. So now, another one of the places this chain of association comes out is, interestingly enough, in dreams. Now, say dreams is this kind of moment when you're asleep, when all your defenses and the distractions of reality are down. That's when your unconscious roams free, says Freud. These strange images that pop up, those strange images that pop up in dreams, that's just the chain of associations rolling along. Now, let's talk about dreams a little bit more. Talking about these wishes coming out. Remember, Most of the things that are in your unconscious are only there because they're too unacceptable, repulsive even, to be accepted by the conscious. And that means that when the unconscious wants to express itself, as it does in a dream, conscious will not allow those wishes to appear in the form that it finds repulsive. So the unconscious finds a way to get around the conscious prohibition, and it does this through a system of disguise. It's like sneaking into a party from which you have been forbidden. You get past the guards by disguising yourself. Now, the only conditions under which the unconscious passes into conscious is through a disguise. And this chain of associations over here provides the means of that disguise. Break his neck, too violent for your sense of self. As I keep on saying, think of a chair. Now this keeps almost all the parts almost happy. To the unconscious, as I was saying, each of these has the same value. Each of these represents everything else to the same degree. So to the unconscious, each of them is the same thing. To think of break or a chair is the same thing. Neck and chair have the same value. But to consciousness, right, which is the you that you're aware of, neck is impossible. You can't admit the neck, but chair is okay, so it comes through as a chair. So the dream that you remember, i.e. the dream that has come into consciousness, is what remains of a wish or a desire or a memory once it has passed through disguise. One of the words that Freud uses for disguise is censorship. It's like a censor that changes things around. It's like going to a costume ball or a dress-up party or a disguise party where all you see are strange costumes and masks. This is one of the reasons that dreams are so weird. It's the disguise pushing things around so that your conscious doesn't recognize them. People love to record their dreams, by the way, to tell other people about them. But all they're doing is looking at the surface disguise. The true content is lurking below the surface, evading your prying eyes. It's like trying to catch a thief and all you grab is their jacket. Your recollection of your dreams is mostly a collection of jackets that you have pulled off their backs. The thieves always escape. But the guards at the door aren't perfect. The disguise is often not perfect, and you can sometimes work out what's happening underneath it. One of the things that the unconscious likes to do with these elements is to blend them together, things together, often in images. So in a dream, you might find yourself thinking when you wake up, it was the shop assistant I saw in the store yesterday. Yes, I really think it was. But it's weird. She looked like my sister in the dream. And wait, even more, she looked quite a lot like my mother. They're all kind of condensed and rolled together. And often in that process of condensation, you can find the truth of what the unconscious is getting at. Who exactly? It looked most like the shop assistant, but really, it was my mother I was dreaming of. So now that I've been speaking so far about this kind of content, right, about mechanisms, right, about the way these things operate in these different parts of the mind. But now I'm going to talk about content. You may notice that so far I've been talking about a map of the mind and also about the mechanisms of how it all works, how it all fits together. But I haven't said much about the content or the subject matter of what goes on in the unconscious. But in fact, Freud gets into a lot of detail about content. It's not just that desires in general get repressed, it's that specific desires get repressed or come to take on more importance. And here we're talking about sex. When Freud analyzes his patients, there is one topic above all others that he finds there, and that's sex. Let me tell you a little story that comes to us from ancient Greece. Oedipus, it's the name of the hero of the story, is a man from the Greek city of Corinth, and he goes traveling. While he's traveling, he gets into a fight at a crossroads, and he kills somebody. He kills a man. Later, as part of his adventures, he arrives in the city of Thebes, which is ruled over by a queen. There he performs a heroic deed that the people of the city much appreciate. He's proclaimed king in gratitude, and he marries the queen of the city and has 2 daughters by her. Several years later, through a strange sequence of events, he discovers that he had in fact been born in the same city of Thebes. In fact, he was the son of the king, but had been given away for adoption at an early age, to the town, in fact, of Corinth, where he had grown up. Now, you may think this is something of a happy fairy tale. Not so. It's a good story. He is born the son of the king, and through a series of accidents of fate, he returns to the place of his birth, although he doesn't know it, and takes his place on the throne. But no, that's not how it turns out. The story takes a dreadful turn. It further emerges that the man he had killed at the crossroads was his own father, and that the woman he has married, the queen, and by whom he has now had 2 children, is his own mother. Now, this is the myth of Oedipus, and it's a famous play by Sophocles. Right? And the play is Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, by Sophocles, the Greek playwright, from around 430 BC in ancient Greece. Now, Freud says it's not just a great play and a myth, but it's a great play because it tells the truth of our own secret desires. Up to now, I've spoken about the unconscious as being the place where our repressed memories and desires end up. For Freud, the most important repressed desire in the unconscious is the one where boys wish to murder their fathers and marry their mothers, and for girls, murder their mothers and marry their fathers. This is what Freud calls the Oedipus complex. And this is probably the most controversial part of Freud's whole work. It's called the Oedipus complex, as I say, and you should know about it because it figures largely in popular culture and cultural history. Now, whether you believe the specific details of it or not, of wanting to murder and then marry, the crucial point concerns the notion of sex being at the core of our unconscious. And it is one of the key ideas of psychoanalysis. And before you scoff too loudly, I say this partly in jest, ask yourself if your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't have lots in common with one of your parents. And look around you and see how many people have partners that look a lot like the parent of their parent of the opposite sex. And if you think about it, it makes sense. When you're young, who are you closest to? Who touches your body? Who caresses you? Who holds you? Who gives you the most love? To the infant, these are intensely pleasurable, yet have to be renounced, as we were saying, as you get older. But these desires, as we saw, don't ever go away. They get pushed into the unconscious, where they stay as desires seeking satisfaction. Now again, whether you believe in Oedipus or not, the idea of sex in the unconscious is central. Freud gives an example of a woman who several times a day rushes into a room, upsets a glass of water onto the tablecloth, and calls for the maid. It's totally bizarre. I'll tell it to you again. There's an example of a woman who several times a day rushes into the living room, upsets a glass of water on the tablecloth, and calls for the maid. It is, as I say, totally bizarre. No one knows what it's about, but it's ruining everybody's life. Now, on analysis, it turns out that this woman had married a man much older than her who could not consummate the marriage. The woman is very embarrassed, and she hopes the maid will not notice in the morning, and so she throws red ink on the sheets. Years later, she has forgotten the episode, but has developed this strange symptom. See how many strands come together here in primary process in the unconscious. First of all, there's sex, and there's the return of the repressed, right? So the whole episode has been repressed, but now it's coming out again in the symptom, in the actual activity. So her wish is to prove that her husband is not impotent, and she repeats the action to show the maid her proof. But see, as I say, the primary process in action through the chain of associations. The maid, so in the actual event, when this is happening, there's one specific maid. But now it's not just that specific maid, any maid will do, right? Blood or red ink or water. You can see the chain of associations. It starts off as blood, even red ink, and then it becomes, years later, water. And you see again the association along the primary process chain. And see the disguise, right? This is also the important part. To the maid, indeed to anyone, it's all meaningless. It doesn't actually mean anything to anybody who's there witnessing the symptom. It only means something in the unconscious. So, to return to civilization and its discontents. We spoke earlier about our inner wishes, not just violence, but most importantly, sex, which has to be controlled by society. Now, we saw that civilization forces us to repress our instincts, our desires, and so we are unhappy. But we've also seen that repression does not work 100% because the repressed always returns. And when it returns, when repression is undone, it threatens to tear society apart. No one is ever happy in the story. As humans, we're unsatisfied because suppressed. But civilization and society is always under attack by failed repression. Society is always in a fragile state, just about to collapse. It's all in a very unstable balance. Now, let me just talk under two headings. I'll talk, for one, let me talk, so there are two headings to kind of look at. One of them is Freud's the kind of revolutionary aspect, and the other is the controversial aspect. So now, just as one of the points about revolution, one of the points where Freud really is revolutionary is thinking about what we now colloquially call craziness or madness, right? Before Freud, mad was pretty much just mad, unreachable. Mad people, strange people, they were kind of beyond any rational reach. Freud was in some ways the first to listen to what were called mad people, and to think that underneath that strangeness, underneath that craziness, there was some internal logic, even if it doesn't make sense within our normal standards of reason. And again, talking about that, so you can see what he's looking at is how primary process doesn't really fit. If you don't have an idea of primary process to secondary process, it all just looks like it's mad. Once Freud begins to develop this notion of primary process, you can see that it has its own internal logic, but it doesn't really fit in with what we now think of, what we think of as kind of secondary process reason. Now, in terms of controversies, all aspects, so many aspects of what Freud writes about was very controversial at the time and is still controversial. Many people don't like the idea of the unconscious, but in fact, I somehow think, my feeling is that most ordinary people, certainly in the Western world, accept the idea of the unconscious, that there's something going on inside us that we're not quite aware of, that kind of has a mind of its own, so to speak. Another one of the areas of controversy is psychoanalytic therapy. Now, what I've been talking about so far is I've been talking about this kind of descriptive model of the mind that Freud comes up with. So he's got one theory about how the mind works, which is everything I've been speaking about. He also develops in parallel with that a system of therapy, which is to kind of help people get better, get over these kind of internal obstructions within their psyches. And it's often people who are against this whole idea of psychoanalysis often point out to the fact that therapy itself sometimes works but often doesn't work. And there have been any number of studies that done that, depending on who you look at them, some people say it's effective, some people say it's not effective. But I just want to say, one of the interesting things is, I don't think that you can use the criterion of effective therapy or not to judge Freud's models, because Freud himself theorizes why therapy is very difficult. Right, which is this notion of, he calls it this idea of resistance, which is what we've been talking about how hard desires attach themselves, how difficult it is to get rid of desires, especially unconscious desires. Once they're in there, it's very, very difficult to get rid of them. So Freud is the first person who would say therapy is no miracle cure and it's no easy fix. It's hard work. Freud is often actually criticized for being extremely pessimistic because he's really I mean, you can try therapy, you can try many things, but once you're in difficulty, it's not easy to get over. I don't mean to depress you, by the way. I'm not. Don't mean to say anything negative about that, but it's not, things that are kind of entrenched within the psyche are very difficult to dislodge. Now, but by far the most controversial aspect of Freud is this idea of sex. And if you mention Freud in popular culture, most people will think of the sex angle. And without a doubt, this is one of Freud's major revolutions. It is, as I say, highly controversial, but simultaneously highly influential. And however much you may knock him and criticize him, I'm afraid he's already won. How so? This idea of sex being at the core of the unconscious also means that sex is at the core of who we are. But if this was a revolutionary idea, if this was a revolutionary idea in 1900s in Vienna, hasn't it become true now? we in our modern times don't stop talking about sex. It's with us all the time. It's so prevalent in our popular culture, from advertising to the way we dress, to music videos. I always say, just think of any video by Nicki Minaj. This all in some ways goes back to Freud. I'm not saying that Freud caused it, but he opened the subject and began thinking about it very early. This idea of humans as inherently sexual, that sex is at our center, is also an idea that is accepted, I think, by most people in Western society, for sure. Before Freud, sex was never really at the center of the universe. Think about how people dressed. Think about how people dressed and behaved. Sex was something never really spoken about, never really acknowledged. This is one of Freud's major revolutions. He really changed the way we think about ourselves. But personally, I think the greatest revolution of Freud is not sex, but the notion of the unconscious. The idea that a part of us is not only beyond our control, but beyond our knowing. That we are not in control of ourselves, that we are strangers to ourselves, that we are not one subject, but two. These ideas are profoundly destabilizing. This goes against everything that we think we are. Our whole civilization is built on the idea that ultimately we are sovereign individuals in control of ourselves, doing what we want. Not so, says Freud. In this respect, Freud is often compared with Darwin. Darwin, of course, shocked everyone by overturning the idea that we are, as humans, a special creation of God. People were amazed at the idea that we are just like animals, related to monkeys and chimpanzees. Freud takes this debunking of our elevated idea of ourselves even further. We are not even in control of ourselves. We are not even masters in our own houses. And his idea of civilization and its discontents is still something that we struggle with every day. Ultimately, says Freud, the part of us that most strongly wants to do what it wants to do cannot, because of civilization. And the part of us that actually can do what it wants to do is really making do with second best. Thank you. Short disturbance here. Yeah, no, that's okay. It always happens, right?
Yeah, it's